following stories make up episodes 71 and 72 of my podcast, Alone in the Woods. To hear more, follow and review Alone in the Woods on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Also send me your scariest woodsy stories at darkstories.org. Thank you. The forests are places of beauty and isolation, where the line between what we know and what we fear blurs. Tonight, we step into the heart of Texas, where quiet cabins and familiar trails give way to whispers of something ancient and malevolent. Stories of witches and unexplainable encounters lurk in the dense forests, leaving even the most seasoned explorers questioning what they saw, or thought they saw. Welcome to Alone in the Woods. I'm Darkness Prevails, and in this episode, we unravel a chilling tale of what happens when the ordinary woods you trust reveal their darker side. If you've ever had a harrowing experience in the wild, share your story at darkstories.org or eeriecast.com/outdoor, and it just might be featured in a future episode. Don't forget to leave us a rating or review on Apple or Spotify. It helps more than you know. Now, throw a log on the fire, because the night is still young. The Witches in the Texas Woods, Parts 1 and 2. From Skip McGripple. Hey y'all! After hearing a story on the Darkness Prevails channel, I was reminded of something that happened to me not too long ago. I have always been very curious, which has landed me in some interesting situations. Some great and some not so great. So I tend to forget a lot of things that have happened to me. I live in the downtown area of a major Texas city. To get away from the city and enjoy the outdoors and some alone time, I would make the hour-and-a-half drive almost every weekend to a small cabin that my folks have in the woods. I've been hanging out at that cabin and those woods almost my entire life, so I felt pretty comfortable there. The area doesn't have many people living there, and it's relatively safe. So one weekend I took some of my friends out there to fish and spend some time away from the city. While fishing on the bank of the river that runs near my folks' cabin, we pulled up some chairs, started a fire, drank a few beers, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. That's the good stuff right there. After sitting around for a few hours, I suggested we go hunting the next morning for breakfast. The guys were not big fans of the idea of waking up early to crawl around in the woods looking for something to eat. They would have rather stayed up all night drinking and fishing and woken up late the next day. "Let's just go hunting now," said one of them. Everyone else agreed and started getting rowdy. I stayed put in my chair and said, No, it's too late and too dark. We wouldn't be able to see a thing out there, man. Plus those dang witches." Everyone knew I made a good point. But then one of them said, "Whoa, what do you mean witches? What are witches anyways? Like, really?" I laughed a bit, because they all seemed so intrigued, and all of the sudden so focused. So I began telling the story of the last time I went camping and hunting in the woods around my parents' cabin. I told them it was just like any other camping-hunting trip I had gone out on. I packed a backpack with all the necessities, a .22 long rifle, and an M&P 45 that I always carry. I parked my truck at my folks' and walked down the dirt road until it disappeared into the woods. I make it a point to not over-hunt in any one area, so I hiked in a direction I knew I had never hunted in. After a few hours of hiking, I found a good clearing in the woods that would have allowed a good amount of moonlight in once it got dark. I don't use a tent when I camp alone, so setting up my camp was fairly easy. I got a fire going, and I hurried off to find some small game for dinner before it got too dark. After bagging a few squirrels and a rabbit, I started to head back to my campsite. The night had already started to settle in, so it was getting quite dark on me. I took a moment to light my lantern that was hanging off my backpack. I poured some lantern oil in it and lit it. A few 100 yards later, I heard movement in the distance. Obviously, while moving through the woods with a backpack with a rifle strapped to it, you make a lot of noise yourself. However, noises that come from deeper in the trees have a distinct sound, like an echo or a reverberation. So when I heard movement coming from somewhere else other than myself, I froze. I stayed completely still and listened. Nothing. My brain started reasoning as fast as it could and concluded that a branch might have fallen or a deer got spooked and hightailed it out of the area. That was good enough for me, so I continued on through the dark in the direction I knew my campsite was. Compasses don't lie, and I had learned how to use them and rely on them by this point of my life. And I heard it again. Noises coming from my right, north, of where I was. And this time I almost thought I heard a yell of some kind. Again I froze. "Coyotes," I said. "Not too worried about coyotes," I continued. The way back was starting to feel really long. But hiking through the woods during the day is very different than hiking through the woods at night. You usually hike slower, watch your steps more carefully, so it's not unusual that a hike the same distance could take longer at night than during the day. Before I go on, I feel like I should say that I was recently married at the time. Probably less than a year at that point. Like I wrote before, I traveled a lot throughout my life, and homesickness was not something I was ever familiar with until I met my wife. I'll call her Juliet here. We met when we were both 18, and up until then, I never missed my home, or anybody really, whenever I was away. But once we started dating, I began to finally experience the feeling of being homesick whenever I was away for too long, and in some cases, not long at all. That Friday evening, I left for the woods. I got home from work and sat down with Juliet for dinner before leaving. It had only been a few hours since I last saw Juliet, and yet I missed her so badly in those woods. So much so that I think I almost felt pain. Having said that, I think it will make what happened next a little more creepy. Again, I heard something. I froze. I stood still in the dark woods and turned to my right. I was deeply confused because I knew exactly what I had just heard. It was Juliet calling me. Although it sounded like she was a bit far, there was no doubt it was Juliet. What is she doing out here? There must be some emergency. I gotta find her. She's probably been calling my phone and it's not even on. Something bad must have happened, I thought, as my brain rushed to rationalize and come up with a realistic conclusion. "Chip!" she yelled through the trees in the distance. My name isn't Chip, but it's what Juliet calls me. And only Juliet. I basically jogged through the dark forest toward where I last heard her, stopping every now and then to listen for her again. Eventually, I had to stop because I hadn't heard Juliet yell for a while. I stood there quietly panicking for what must have been 5 minutes, but every second was torturous. I felt like I had failed to help my wife. She came all the way out here to find me because she needed me, and I couldn't even find my way to her. And then I heard her again. "Chip." Her voice quietly resonated through the tall trees, and she sounded like she was in pain. I began to walk as quietly as I could toward her so I could hear her if she called out to me again. And she did, and she sounded noticeably closer. I felt relief as I felt myself getting closer and closer to Juliet. "Chip?" I heard through the trees. But this time I felt alarmed. I felt like I was about to be in danger. But I shook it off and continued toward my wife. "Chip." Again I heard her calling me, but she didn't sound quite right. It was if she was in pain, but also like it wasn't her at all. Just like two different people can say the same things in the same pitch and rhythm, but they can never sound exactly like each other. Like there was somebody else pretending to be Juliet and mimicking her voice. but I had heard her so clearly just a few moments ago. I figured she was choking up trying not to cry, so I kept moving. Again and again I heard Juliet calling me as I walked closer and closer. Each time she called, though, her voice sounded less and less like her own voice. By the time she sounded like she was only 10 or so yards away, I was on high alert. It sounded nothing like her by then. Whoever it was calling me, she wanted me to believe she was Juliet. And by then, I knew for sure it wasn't her. I approached carefully with my handgun drawn. This person wasn't moving one bit, but I could tell where she was. I walked closer, inch by inch, holding my lantern up in front of me, trying to see who I was dealing with. Then, peeking from around a tree, I saw 2 eyes reflecting the flame from my lamp. I have to admit, at that moment I was terrified. Juliet is shorter than I am, and I was eye to eye with whoever this was, and her eyes were too far apart to have been Juliet's. "Hey, is everything all right?" I asked, like an idiot. "Chip," she said, "I can give you anything you want." I knew right away what she really was. I knew her malicious intentions. "Jesus, help me," I said under my breath in a fearful whisper, gun still in my hand, safely aimed toward the ground with my finger off the trigger. As soon as the words left my mouth, she visibly flinched, as if she had smelled something disgusting. I could only tell by her silhouette and the reflections in her eyes, though. I stood still, realizing what I had just said, while she backed away from me, back into the darkness. Up until this point during my story, my buddies sat staring at me completely silent, listening to me speak. "Dude, why didn't you just shoot her? You had a gun, right?" said one of the guys, the youngest of us all. I told them it would have been useless to shoot the witch. It wouldn't have killed her, or even hurt her, probably. "How? Why?" he replied. I began to explain to them what witches really are. People who practice witchcraft and offer rituals to demons, they conjure in return for something they want. My theory was that this witch in particular achieved immortality through the sacrifice of people and animals. I could tell they were thinking it over and trying to decide whether to believe me or not. And to those of y'all listening, I know y'all might think this is unbelievable. And if I hadn't seen it all before, I wouldn't believe it either. The truth is my parents were, and still are, very prominent figures in the church that I grew up in. Being elders of the church community, they both performed exorcisms throughout my childhood. And no, I don't mean the stereotypical Hollywood Catholic priest with the little white thing on his neck under a black jacket holding up a wooden cross. They belong to a Hispanic Protestant denomination that, in fact, thoroughly disagree with and oppose Catholicism. Being too young to stay home alone most of the time, my folks would take me with them on house calls to pull demons out of people. It was a horrible experience every time. In Latin American cultures, it's not uncommon for people and their kids to visit witch doctors or healers when feeling sick or when they want their lives to move in a better direction, and sometimes when they want harm to come upon someone who has wronged them. Participating in these rituals is like an open invitation for demons and leaves people vulnerable to demonic activity. So there was always someone in need of help in our community. I watched and listened to everything my parents did during exorcisms and read every book my dad kept in his office about the subject. By the time I had this incident in the woods, I already knew what and what not to do very well. I resumed my story after explaining a bit more to my buddies. I stood in the dark forest with my lamp held up with my outstretched arm until I could neither see nor hear the witch backing away. My adrenaline took a little while to fully dissipate, and then fear hit me hard. I tried walking back to my campsite steadily and quietly. but my nerves got the best of me and ended up almost sprinting through the dark. I was pretty confident I could find my way back, but either way I checked my compass frequently. Yet after running and running in the correct direction, I never reached my campsite. I felt confused and doubted myself like never before. Maybe I really don't know anything about being in the woods. How could I have gotten myself lost? I wondered. I turned around and walked until I saw a familiar pattern in the trees. Once I felt confident about where I was, I forced myself to walk back to where I ran into the witch. When I found the tree she was initially hiding behind, I stared at it for a good while, expecting her to peek around it again. But nothing. Thankfully. I retraced my steps back to where I detoured off my path to follow Juliet's voice, and after hiking a bit longer, I found my campsite. I was exhausted, covered in sweat, scratched up, hungry, and humiliated by the woods. I considered packing everything up and starting on the long walk back to the cabin, but I had no energy. I ate and called it a night. I didn't sleep much even though I felt entirely drained. The woods were very loud that night, even by a summer night standard. The bugs and animals didn't stop to take a breath for a second, and the owls were particularly aggressive as well. I could hear them screaming near and far. All night, every time I began to drift off into rest, I would get woken up to the owls' screams echoing in the forest, or at least what I assumed to be owls. I turned to look at the guys and asked them if they were still down to creep into the woods. They looked at each other and hesitantly said yes, nervously chuckling. "Well, y'all go ahead. I'm not going in there right now," I said, laughing to myself. "But it didn't do anything to you. You scared her away," one of them said. "Maybe, but only because I said Jesus," I replied. "Well, then just say it again if she comes back," he said, noticeably irritated. "It's not that simple," I said. "I think you really have to believe for that to work, and I can say I really did believe back then. But now, I won't be calling on anybody to come help me." After I said that, I don't remember much about that night, other than all of us ending the night by watching Blood Diamond in the cabin. It's the only movie my folks have in there. I think it was already there when they bought the place. As for what I said about believing, I'm not send $100, it's right. Most demons hate God and Jesus, and I'm not sure if they care if you believe in God or not. It's not that I don't believe in God anymore. However, the only reason I do believe is because I've seen the other side of things. That witch knew what I loved and what I missed, and that I would do anything for Juliet. I've seen and felt evil, but I've never felt God. Once I had written out and published my previous story, I left the tab open on my laptop. My wife, Juliet, and I share an office at home, and she occasionally uses my computer to browse or work. While I was busy somewhere else in the house, she read the story I had written on my laptop. When I returned to the office to work on stuff, I found her sitting at my desk, staring at the computer screen, with my story on Dark Stories, open with her chin resting on her hand, deep in thought. "Hey, did you read my story? What did you think of it?" I asked. "Did that really happen?" she asked very curiously. "Yeah, it was scary as hell," I said. "When was this?" she asked, and we began to try and figure out the exact date that event took place. Like I mentioned in my original post, we were recently married at the time of the encounter, so it gave us a good idea of when it happened. But I did make a lot of trips out there back then, so it was impossible to find the exact date for sure. But she mentioned she remembered one weekend in particular where I came home early and was in a sort of weird and bummed out mood. Now, that's not all that uncommon, since there have been a few times that I came home from hunting empty-handed. But she said that when she asked me if I killed anything, I said yes. To which she said, "Oh, that's great, babe." And we went on about our day. However, she said she could still tell something was bothering me. So we concluded that that must have been the day after I had my run-in with the witch. "You never told me about that. Why?" she asked me, like I had withheld critical information from her. "I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty sure I was still a bit shaken up. It was a rough night. I must have not been in the mood to talk about it." I replied to her, starting to feel a little defensive. I really didn't see any reason for her to react the way she did. "So what?" I said. "What does it matter now? That was a long time ago, honey." She stared at the floor, still sitting in my chair at my desk, riffling through her memories in her head. I could tell by the way she bit the corner of her bottom lip. I stood at the doorway of our office, staring at her. Visibly confused, I'm sure. "I remember that night," she said, as she looked back up at me. Her eyes widened and she kind of started creeping me out a bit. "I was in bed watching TV and I kept hearing noises and taps at our window, so I crawled to your side of the bed and raised the blinds to take a look." "And?" I asked. Now I really didn't know what to expect. "There was an owl standing on our AC unit. Like I said in my earlier post, we used to live in an apartment in the downtown area of the city we live in. Our apartment had an AC unit in our bedroom that took up half of the window next to my side of the bed. The blinds came down from the ceiling and rested halfway down the window on the top of the AC unit. Our room was on the second floor, so there wasn't any chance there was a person standing outside our window. When Juliet lifted the blinds, she said she saw the owl and sat there fascinated, watching it for almost an hour. She said she talked to it every now and then to see if she could get it to hoot, but it never did. "It just stared at me the entire time," Juliet said. "Eventually it just flew away." "You think that was the witch I saw that night or something?" I asked her, a little skeptical. She said it could have been a type of astral projection and/or shape-shifting the witch could have used to get to her. Juliet's theory was that the witch in the woods went to meet her at our apartment to look at her and listen to her in order to mimic her back in the woods and lure me to her. Although Juliet was never involved with the exorcisms my parents performed, she did witness a few before we separated from their practices and distanced ourselves from them. The experience led her on her own journey into studying witchcraft and the occult, and she has gained a deeper understanding of certain practices that I haven't. I'm not sure exactly what went on that night at home, and as far as I'm concerned, Juliet could very well be right in her theory. After all, with experience and a deep understanding of how to acquire and use power, there's very little that isn't possible for a witch. Juliet and I laid in the guest bed we have in the office for the remainder of the night, discussing her theory and all the possibilities. She also brought up our yearly camping trips since getting married, and noted that we almost always had owls perching up on trees above our tent and on the ground around our campsites. I told her I once woke up during a solo summer camping trip to find 3 owls standing about 10 feet away from my feet. They were rather large and were making threatening hisses and screeches. I didn't wait around for too long. Since I don't use tents when I camp alone, I packed up fairly quickly and took off toward my truck in the middle of the night. And then we almost simultaneously mentioned the owl that frequently sits in the large tree in our front yard and the owl that sits on the fence along our backyard. I have begun to consider that it might be time to call for help again. 2 for 1. From Smiling Ginger 926. Trigger warning: violence against pets. I'm a 30-year-old man who has lived in Texas my entire life. I've had weird things happen to me ever since I was little. but this story is about something that happened to me at the beginning of 2021. Something that changed my life, and something I will never forget. My divorce was coming to a completion as I sat in my new home, 2 acres in central Texas, on land, with half of it going into the surrounding woods. We had neighbors, but the property we bought was on the outskirts of a friend's land and was around half a mile from the nearest one. My home is around half an acre from the edge, and I often enjoyed sitting on my porch and watching deer with my new loves, my girlfriend, and our 1-year-old puppy. One night after a nice home-cooked meal, my girlfriend smiled at me, causing me to swell with newfound happiness I had forgotten even existed. We watched some YouTube videos and got ready for bed. I let our dog, Mazakine, out one last time before stretching and putting some dishes in the sink. But as I did, something caught my eye through the window above the sink. A set of red dots at the fence line. They almost looked like 2 laser pointers pointing a few inches apart in the bushes. I shook it off, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. I worked nights usually, and passed the time at work by listening to Darkness Prevails, so I figured it was just the usual mind racing back to the stories. I looked at the time and realized our fur baby had been outside for around 20 minutes, which for her was odd, because by now she'd have been scratching at the door. Shrugging, I sat down and decided to wait for her to let me know she was ready to come inside. I dozed off but startled awake when I heard a yipping sound. Slightly confused about where I was, I looked at the time and realized it had been an hour and a half since I let her out. I heard the yip again and thought maybe coyotes were outside in the woods again and maybe she'd gone to investigate. Getting worried, I strapped my pump-action 12-gauge to my back and walked out the front door, calling her to come inside, but got no reply. Even more worried, I grabbed my inspection light, which was a headlight rated to 720 lumens, and for anyone who is familiar with these lights, knows it's very bright. I turned it on and pumped my shotgun before I walked towards where the yipping was coming from. Around 15 feet from the house, what I saw horrified me. There was a small spatter of blood in the grass. Scared and angry at whatever had happened to my pup, I called her again louder and began following a trail of blood. I heard something run behind me, something fast, something heavy. I whipped around, gun pointed high, but didn't see anything. From the direction I had just been looking a moment before, I heard a deep laugh and turned slowly back to the spot. I could tell it was tall. Even hunched over, it was around 6 feet off the ground. I'm only around 5'7", so this thing was massive. I kept my gun trained on it, even though I was horrified, as I watched it stare at me. It raised its clawed hand up and bit into what it was holding. I stumbled and almost dropped my 12-gauge as I realized it was Mazakine, her limp, lifeless body dripping blood down its arm and face, a face that haunts my nightmares to this day. It was a skull crossed between a wolf and a deer. In fact, it had antlers, but they were strange. Instead of typical antlers, it looked more like jagged tree branches growing from its head and down its shoulders and spine. Angry at whatever this thing was for taking one of my family from me, I took 2 steps forward and put a slug into it, pumped it, and unloaded another into it. Both rounds hit and splattered black goo on the tree behind it. It screeched and leapt 15 feet into the nearest pine tree. It looked down on me, and I felt goosebumps, like it was telling me I had just messed up. I uttered a very impolite word and started to run backwards, never lowering the gun out of fear. That's when it charged me, jumping down and running straight at me like a hound of hell. Cursing again, I pulled the trigger, and I saw it easily dodge it and gain ground. Terrified, but unable to do anything, I tried to outrun it the remaining 20 feet to my door, but ran into something solid. I looked up, and to my terror, realized there was another. It cocked its head at me and opened its mouth, huge, jagged teeth dripping with saliva and dried remains of past victims. It dropped down, arms on either side of where I'd fallen, and began to laugh. It was an eerie sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere, but nowhere. I could feel its rancid breath as it lowered, and I began to realize this was it for me. I tried to push it away and flattened myself to the ground further, but it didn't do any good. It just continued slowly, torturously, almost as though it was enjoying eking out every ounce of fear that it could. Closing my eyes tight, I waited to feel its teeth sink into me when I felt its weight lift off me and a loud crash. The other one had leapt onto it, and they were slashing and ripping at each other's emaciated flesh. It was vicious, and it had the aura of watching two ancient titans battle. I quietly stood up, grabbing the gun as I did, and watched in horror as I eased to the front door, and it dawned on me that this was a battle for food. Me. I tried to dart the rest of the way to the door, but it didn't do any good. They realized I was escaping and turned to me and screeched together in a sound that made me feel as though my head was going to split in two. I made it to the front step and fell, feeling paralyzed. They both stared back at me when the front door burst open. My girlfriend was standing there with a Taurus 9mm I had gotten her for her birthday. She fired 2 shots into each one's chest, and they jumped back again and screamed. I tried to tell her to get back into the house, that a 12-gauge slug wasn't going to stop these things. Surely a 9mm wouldn't do anything. But to my amazement, they started to back off, and the bleeding from the small wounds it caused wasn't healing like the ones I had caused earlier had. Not taking her eyes off of them or lowering the handgun, she helped me up and brought me into the house. She closed and locked the doors and sprinkled some ash from the fireplace by the door, where I had just been dragged in by her. I looked around and saw she'd done the windows and back door already as well. Something about her you should know is she's a practicing Wiccan and loves old-school lore and such. She smiled and said, "According to the native folklore, white ash can keep them at bay and can actually harm them, and that she'd rolled the shells in it before loading her gun up. Killing them is way harder, but we were safe for the time being." She began to bandage my right arm, where I hadn't noticed a long cut. It wasn't deep, but if I hadn't been so numb, I definitely would have felt it. "Mazes," I began, but she cut me off and said sadly, "I know. I heard the yipping and looked out our window. I saw them and then..." She looked scornfully at me. "I saw you walking out to investigate." I smiled sheepishly at her when there was a loud thunk and a screech from the roof that made me jump, and a loud scratching and bang on the front door. Sighing, she looked around. They definitely aren't happy with us. The next day, I put the house up for sale, and we moved into an apartment in the next town over. When we had gone to collect our things for the move, I bribed several friends with beer and barbecue to come with us to help. I walked to the edge of the woods to try and get Maze's remains for a proper burial, but all I found was her bloody collar and black goo on the tree and ground where I'd hit it. I looked into the woods because I watched. I saw it deep inside the woods, just out of sight of the others, smiling at me, and then it just vanished. I ran back, and we packed as much as we could. In total, it took us 2 days. On the way to our apartment, I was riding with my buddy, and he asked me what happened to my back door. Confused, I said, "What are you talking about? And he replied, "There were 3 bloody gouges deep in the wood. It looked like a bear or something, but whatever those claws belonged to were huge." He hesitated and said, "When I touched it, the blood was still wet and warm." I blanched and told him to get me the hell out of there. I never went back, and I hope that I never have to. I almost died and was only saved because of my now amazing wife and the creature's own greed. I know what they were, and I never want to see another Wendigo as long as I live. I drew a picture of the creature I saw. Believe me or not, I have the scars and memories to prove it. It attacked us. From It's Me, Mr. P12. This story happened about 4 years back on my 20th birthday. It was a Friday night, and I was hanging out with my friends who we'll call Jack, Brian, and Steve. It was just the 4 of us, as this was the period of the pandemic, so most people were shut away. So despite the fact we really couldn't have a huge party, we were still having fun. After the party, we wanted to do something fun and interesting. We decided to go for a walk in the woods. I know, stupid, right? A walk in the woods in the middle of the night was unnecessarily risky, but we were bored and wanted to do something fun before the night ended. I lived out of town, and my house was surrounded by woods. We walked into the woods, and we decided to play hide and seek. I know 4 grown men playing hide and seek in the woods, but it sounded fun at the time. We decided that Brian would be the one that will be first to seek. As Brian counted, the 3 of us split up, and I saw Jack crouching down in some bushes and Steve hiding under a huge rock. I climbed up a tree and sat in one of the branches. A few moments later, Brian yelled out that he was finished and started searching for us. While Brian was searching, I wanted to see how the trees looked from above, so I climbed higher and higher until I reached the top. As I reached the top, I realized that the woods had suddenly gotten very quiet. I felt a little uncomfortable because it felt as if I was being watched. I looked around me and saw these lights a few yards away from me, in another top of a tree. I watched these lights for a few minutes until I realized that these weren't lights. They were eyes, big yellowish eyes looking at me. These eyes slowly began to lower down the tree they were in. As I watched them slowly fade away, I heard Brian screaming, "I found you, Steve!" I looked down and saw Brian walking under me, and then, out of nowhere, I saw a huge shadow creeping behind Brian. I hurried down the tree, trying to warn my friend, but I heard a scream, an awfully loud scream of Brian yelling out. Me and Jack came running to see what happened, and what we saw was the most disturbing thing I have ever seen crouching over Brian, with its back turned to us. The moon gave us enough light to illuminate the thing. It was black as the night itself and skinny. Jack threw a rock at the thing, and it didn't even flinch. It slowly turned around, revealing a mouth that had long and sharp teeth. But the most unsettling part of the thing was its eyes. The thing stood up, and it was huge, like 7 to 8 feet tall. It didn't have a nose and had these deer-like antlers on its head. We looked at the thing as it looked back at us, not knowing what to do. On the other side, I saw Steve signaling me that we should make a break for it. We agreed, and Jack and I turned around and started sprinting for the house. Behind us, we heard Steve and Brian running, and the thing following them, making a growling sound and a woman's scream mixed. It's hard to describe. As we made it to the clearing, me and Jack turned around and waited for the other 2. Suddenly, Brian fell to the ground and was dragged a few feet backwards. Steve grabbed Brian by the arms and started to pull. Jack and I helped Steve as Brian pleaded and screamed at us not to let go, with tears in his eyes. I can still remember Brian's face as my friend was about to be dragged away by some creature. It still makes me want to tear up as I'm typing this, knowing that if we didn't help, Brian might not have survived the night. Steve picked up a big stick and struck the thing in one of its eyes. The thing let out a scream so loud it felt like my eardrums were about to burst. It stood still, and I kid you not, it smiled at us, revealing its grotesque-looking teeth. It turned and darted into the woods. We didn't waste any time as we helped Brian to his feet, and we saw that his leg was bleeding profusely. We ran back to the house dragging Brian, still hearing those screams of the thing in the woods. We called 911, and when the paramedics arrived asking about what happened, we just said that a bear attacked us. But we all know that what we experienced was not a bear. A few days later, me, Jack, and Steve went back to the edge of the woods, trying to find any evidence of the thing, but all we found was a piece of Brian's skin lying in the grass. I haven't told anyone about this till now. Please, if you have any idea what that thing was, please let me know. My encounter with a skinwalker, from James Joseph Cahill. Hello, boys and girls. I first want to clarify that not all skinwalkers/werewolves are inherently bad. To start the story, I am literally the most famous homeless guy in Canada. Please Google Homeless James and Muckwa for verification. And I have spent the last 7.5 years walking all of the way across Canada in order to help other homeless people with pets. This being said, on with my story. Back in 2017, as my 140-pound Alaskan Malamute Muckwa and I were walking around half of Lake Superior, Sault Ste. Marie to Thunder Bay, we came across the most difficult part of our entire walk. The Montreal River Harbor. It's the place that they warned Terry Fox about. Please feel free to look that up. Anyway, this is not the highest or longest hill in Canada, but it is literally the steepest hill in Canada. Now, Montreal River Harbor has an enormous hydroelectric power plant that not only supplies power as far north as Wawa, Ontario, it also supplies power for both Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, sister cities. And although several dozens of people work there, there are only a very small handful of people who actually live there. There's the guy who owns the food truck and the family that runs the Twilight Campground. And that's absolutely it. For 200 kilometers in every direction, there are no residents, aside from the people I just mentioned. Walking into Montreal River Harbor, we had already planned on spending a couple of days at the Twilight Campground, and exactly 15 kilometers further north was our next planned stop at the Agawa Bay Campground. They had campers and staff, but no residents. For this story, I do need to inform you that my dog Muckwa was 8 years old at the time, and she had never been fixed. I always wanted to breed her, but never got around to it. During our 2 days at the Twilight Campground, Muckwa had been in heat. This will come into play a little later. I also need to tell you about our cart. I had started by pushing all of our belongings in a double-wide 3-wheel jogging stroller. But the more items we collected, the more weight, and the stroller just couldn't handle it anymore. So I built my own cart, capable of carrying up to 700 pounds. At this time, I had about 600 pounds in it. Now, Muckwa and I would usually walk around 20 to 25 kilometers per day. Back then, I was a lot younger and in way better shape. So the 15-kilometer walk from Montreal River Harbor to Agawa Bay should have been no problem, right? Wrong. That hill was so bloody steep that it took us 6 hours to walk the 4 kilometers to the top, and then another hour just to recuperate from it. So about 10 kilometers into the day's walk, it started getting dark, and we needed a place to rest for the night. I also need to mention that during this time we were being followed by Something really big, with gray fur, that I kept on seeing out of the corner of my eye about 50 yards back in the woods. Well, about half an hour before dark, we finally came across a place called Crescent Lake Park. So I pushed the cart to the back of the park's parking lot and set up our tent. I got us something to eat, and we went to bed. Mukwa always slept in the tent with me. Around 3 a.m., I was woken up by a very large animal walking circles around our tent. So I switched on my inside light, grabbed up my flashlight, and opened up the tent flap. I found myself exactly 18 inches and face to face with a 200-pound plus great gray Canadian timber wolf. These are the largest wolves in North America. And at this point, most people would be soiling their pants. But please believe me when I tell you that this was literally the most hilarious sight I have ever seen in my entire life. This guy looked exactly like a bumbling teenager overloading on hormones. He was staring at Mukwa, even though his eyes looked crossed to me. His tongue was almost hanging on the ground, and he was doing a little side-to-side two-step with his front paws. In other words, he was thinking with the little head instead of the big one. And as far as he was concerned, I may as well have been a tree stump. By this time, Mukwa had woken up, and just as she stood up, this comical bonehead comes walking right into the tent like he owns it, walks right up to Mukwa, licks her once on the side of her face, and then walks back out and starts dancing from side to side right out front of the tent. And before I could do anything to stop her, Mukwa walks outside and starts playing with this guy. The two of them kept me up for the rest of the night watching them play, and several times the wolf tried to get Mukwa to go into the woods with him, and each time he did, Mukwa would just look at me, and I would shake my head and say no. I couldn't handle a litter of puppies on our walk. Well, finally close to 6 a.m., the sun started coming up and playtime was over. So the wolf just started heading off at a slow run into the woods, and this is where it gets really freaky. Mukwa and I were just sitting at the front of the tent, watching the wolf trot on out into the woods when I turned around for a few seconds to grab my smokes out of my tent. And when I turned back, it was no longer a wolf. Running into the woods, it was a naked man where the wolf had been. This is the first time I have ever told anyone about seeing the wolf turn into a man. Although I did write about this in my book, I actually left out that little detail. Who would actually believe it? Witch's Way, from C. Philly 100. Over the river and through the wood. My friend Elle and I were walking down this old Forest Service road, locals call Witch's Way, talking about the legend of Slender Man. I was saying that I thought it was just an urban legend that had gone viral because some girl killed her friend or whatever. We were walking down this dirt road, walking my dog, when we heard something off in the woods before us. At first, it sounded like the wind, but then it sounded like a chainsaw or a dirt bike or something, and then again, it was more like a deer in distress, and then like the wind again. The weird thing was, my dog was fixated on the sound, and he was freaked out, which put me on high alert. I knew there wasn't anything for miles around, and that's why the sound of a chainsaw was so unusual. Anyway, we paused for a moment to reflect on the sound when this pine tree, like 50 yards off, started shaking violently. I got this eerie feeling that something was really not right. The air itself just felt unnatural. I felt myself becoming disoriented, and my nose smelled like gasoline mixed with rotten garbage. I fell to the ground, and I thought I could see something moving through the trees at a freakishly fast pace. It reminded me of when those people were running around in that Naruto style or whatever that whole Area 51 thing was about. I looked over at Elle, and I had to second-guess myself, because Elle seemed to be just fine, while meanwhile I was feeling like I was about to pass out or vomit or both. But that impression didn't last long, because when I turned around again, Elle was doubled over, spitting and puking all over the ground. The stench of natural gas was so strong, I thought there must be a burst pipe somewhere, and I was trying to fight off the urge to fall asleep. My dog was whining and growling at the trees, which were all seemingly swaying now. Again, we heard that unnatural wind sound, almost like someone was breathing through a hollow wood whistle or something. And again, I saw someone or something darting off in my peripheral vision. I couldn't really focus on any one spot, but now it seemed like multiple figures moving from tree to tree, flowing back and forth with the trees, causing an optical illusion that made me feel like heaving. It sounded like chanting coming from the trees. I fell on my back and felt myself slipping away. I knew I couldn't hold on for long in this semi-conscious state. I heard a dry crackling sound coming from just above my head, and I looked up to see my worst nightmare coming to life. There before me was an incredibly tall woman. I am 6'2", and I swear this lady was towering over me. She had sickly black hair, and her face was shrouded in shadows, but she wore a tattered and threadbare cloak that smelled strongly of sagebrush. She slowly reached out to touch me, and I had this dire feeling that I would surely die if she made contact. Her hands were long and crooked, and her fingernails were caked in grime. My dog lunged at the thing, and I crawled backward, trying my best to get as far away from this wicked hag as possible, given my highly impaired state. The smell of gas mixed with burnt sage was sickening. The witch woman kicked my dog and appeared to hover above the ground before letting out a shrill shriek and flying right at me before peeling off back into the trees again. I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing. Had I really just seen a 10-foot witch creature fly off into the woods? Was this perhaps but a mere side effect of whatever gaseous odor had permeated every fiber of my being? Was I simply hallucinating, or was this really happening? Again, the thing flew out from the trees, seeming to glide across the ground as it reached its pale, crooked fingers toward me again. I could see her face now. I couldn't tell if she was extremely beautiful or extremely hideous. She looked like a young Irish lass mixed with a wicked old hag and a great white raven all at once. She had no lines on her face, but I knew this woman was as old as the hills. Her eyes were whitish gray, and once I made eye contact, I couldn't look away. I was transfixed, entranced by her sorcery. She muttered a low, guttural curse, and I felt my feet leave the ground, back parallel to the cold black earth, and head contorted, looking back. She hissed at me, and I felt a burning sensation in my abdomen. I truly thought my stomach was about to explode when my dog threw himself into the woman with every last ounce of strength he could muster in the gaseous haze. I fell to the ground and grabbed my dog's collar, pulling him down the hill. I could hear the thing cackle before flowing up into a tree, and then leaping from tree to tree back up toward the trailhead. I hoisted myself up to my feet and groaned with the pressure as I think I fractured my ribcage. My dog was whining softly, and Elle was nowhere to be seen. I realized that the thing must have gone after Elle, so I ran back up toward the trailhead, when once more I was hit with that sickening dead and rotten odor. I looked up to see the witch hovering over Elle's seemingly lifeless body, drawing her essence out through her mouth like a faint trail of misty vapor. I grabbed a rock and launched it, beaming this thing in the back and causing her to roll off to the other side of Elle's body. I rushed over to try to revive the still-breathing Elle when that thing seemed to materialize all around me in swirling wreaths of smoky mist and shadows. I could hear her all around me, in my head, laughing at my inability to fight back, splaying my mind like a hide when it's drying, sucking my heart out by some weird osmosis, draining my essence and blunting my senses. My vision was blurry, but I could still see this woman cackling in the shadows and filling my mind with dark and evil thoughts. Her face was crooked and distorted, her eyes raving mad and demonic. I fell back on my knees and prayed that God might deliver me from this wicked hag. And just when I thought all was lost, a single ray of sunlight shone down through the shadowy mist and illuminated the murkish wreaths, causing them to burn off in little waves. I threw myself into the light and could feel the evil peeling back. When I came to, Elle and I were lying in an open field, my dog by my side. The birds were chirping and the frogs were croaking, and the sun was still high in the sky. I wondered if it had all been some terrible dream when I noticed that there were 5 fingerprints seared into the flesh of my right arm, where that thing had apparently grabbed me. I think I lost consciousness again, or went into shock or something. But I'll tell you what, I'm never going back down Witch's Way again. There's a Bigfoot in Arizona. From Dying Cry 53. This story starts back in the year 2015. I was 12 and we lived in a small town in Arizona called Payson. It's surrounded by miles of woods. I lived about a mile out of town, and at night I'd go out in my front yard and do knocks, and I did a pretty good Bigfoot scream. But the night I stopped going outside alone, I'll never forget. It was a Friday, and I was outside doing my routine, and all of a sudden, my neighbor screamed. Not like an annoyed way, but in fear, and after that she slammed her front door, and I heard the heaviest, hardest footsteps I have ever heard in my life. I was terrified, and I've never been scared of anything but this. This was something completely different. It started getting closer. I jumped up and ran into my house, locking the door, and almost passed out from the fear. I turned my front porch lights off and looked out the window. And there it was. Bigfoot. It was crouched, eating a poor cat. I stopped breathing. I knocked on the window, and that's when it stopped and looked straight at me. I kid you not, it started standing up. My blood ran cold. It stood at 8 feet tall and started to make a rumbling sound. I backed up and went and told my mother and father. My dad told me to get the .410 shotgun, and he grabbed his .30-30. But the size of that thing, you would most likely need a 12-gauge slug to slow it down, and if that doesn't work, maybe a .50 caliber. We went outside about an hour and a half later, putting it at about 12 a.m. But as soon as we stepped out of the house, we were hit with the most disgusting rotten smell. I had helped my father move a week-old roadkill elk, and this was much worse. It was so bad my eyes started watering my dad, and I walked up to where I saw it, and sure enough there was blood and cat hair. My dad stopped and looked me dead in my eyes and said, "Cam, you just encountered a Bigfoot." I'm 21 now, and I'm engaged. I have never forgotten that night. I've since told my fiancée she's a bit skeptical. I don't blame her, but I am a man of my word. However, I can understand how some people don't believe in Bigfoot. But the thing people call Bigfoot is big. He's not going to hide in small places. He's going to be deep in the woods and away from civilization. And some of you may be wondering how I saw it. Maybe it's because I attracted it, or maybe it was a young one that was curious. But all I know is that Bigfoot is real and dangerous. Be aware of your surroundings in the woods, because no matter how much you feel comfortable in the woods, thinking you are alone, you never are and never will be. The woods are their home. Think of it like you're a guest to them, and you messed up their house. I still go into the woods, but I am a little more aware of my surroundings. Maybe trolls. From Larper. Hello. Here is one of many experiences from the Danish wilderness. I live close to a medium forest around a lake. There are many stories from the area over the years of people who have seen trolls, hulders, ghosts, and witches, and there are also some who have mysteriously disappeared. I use the area to practice for LARP events and overnight in nature, which starts this experience with me huddled in my goblin gear with a backpack on filled with food, water, and a tent. And off into the woods I went. Here I find a good place with no stones and a good distance from the lake. After some time, I set up the tent and started practicing as a goblin, and time is going fast. Before I knew it, it was dark, so I got ready to go to sleep. My nose, ears, and armor are taken off, but I have to accept myself having the green paint overnight. I woke up startled by the sound of something very big moving between the trees, and something that sounded like an elephant. But it's very obvious there are no elephants here. I became nervous about what it is, and now it sounds like there are several of them all around my tent. But then it got completely quiet, and I was relieved, and eventually fell asleep again. I'm not so easily intimidated. The next morning, I wake up and get out of the tent when I see there are 5 big stones about 6 to 7 meters high around the tent in a circle. I have heard about trolls before, and that they turn into stones in daylight, so I decided to pack up and go home to talk about what had happened. I have since been back to look, but the stones were now in a completely different place. This is just one experience out of many. I have also met a beautiful naked woman with purple eyes singing and living in the lake, a long-distance witch ritual, and more experiences with ghosts than I can count. Thanks for listening to my story. Nightly Encounters with Bigfoot. From Mutant APK. So, I have had 4 encounters so far with Bigfoot. Mind you, I never saw it. It was more like I heard them. I say them because it sounds like there is more than one where I live. A couple of years ago, when I was taking my dogs out before coming to bed at 11 at night, I was about to bring them inside when I heard a bunch of howls and wood knocks. At first, I thought it was the coyotes doing the howls, but these sounded deeper. After I brought the dogs in, I decided to look up what that sound was. Honestly, I got chills when I found those howls matched those of a California Bigfoot. My next encounter was when my mom couldn't sleep, as she kept hearing a howling noise outside. So I decided to go see what it was. Boy, I wish I hadn't, as when I got out there, I heard the howling again like before, but this one sounded like it was 2 of them, one in each direction. I had to get inside, as basically, call it a cliché horror troupe, but I actually felt the hairs on the back of my neck standing straight up. My 3rd encounter, I was once again taking the dogs out for their nightly walk, and once again, as I was about to bring them back inside, up on the hill that is nearby, I heard 3 distinct wood knocks. My most recent encounter was again when I was taking the dogs out for their nightly walk. When my newest puppy reared up on her hind legs as if she saw something, I tried to shine my flashlight to where she was looking, but I didn't see anything. She started growling at something, and I was telling her to come on as I'm pulling on the leash. Suddenly, I felt this whoosh of air beside me, and I noticed something landed right beside me with a low thud. I shined the flashlight and saw a rock about the size of my fist landed right beside me. So something must have thrown it at me. I haven't had any more aggressive encounters so far, but I'm not going to provoke it into being aggressive. Rugaru Encounter Story. From Anonymous. I grew up in a small house on the outskirts of Wilmot, Arkansas, surrounded by dense woods and winding bayous. It was the kind of place where the quiet could either soothe your soul or put you on edge, depending on your mood. The nights were especially dark out there, the kind of dark where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face without a flashlight. It was the only home I'd ever known, and I never thought twice about living so close to the wilderness. That changed one cold, rainy night when I came face to face with something I still struggled to explain. It was late, close to midnight, and I was driving home from a friend's house. The gravel road leading to my house cut through an open field before disappearing into the woods. The rain had been falling steadily all evening, turning the road into a slick mess of mud and puddles. My truck's headlights pierced through the gloom, illuminating the narrow path ahead. I'd driven that road countless times and was used to spotting deer or raccoons darting across the way. So when I saw movement in the distance, I slowed down, expecting the usual. What stepped into the beam of my headlights was anything but usual. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, the details didn't add up. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall, and stood upright like a man. Its body was covered in long, wet fur that clung to its frame, dark and matted from the rain. A long, bushy tail swung behind it, and its head was what froze me in place. It had the features of a wolf, a long snout, pointed ears, and glowing red eyes that seemed to burn in the darkness. It paused in the middle of the road, turning its head to look directly at me. For a moment, we locked eyes, and I felt an overwhelming wave of dread. Those eyes weren't just animalistic. They held something more, an intelligence that made my stomach churn. The creature stood there for what felt like an eternity before turning and disappearing into the woods with a fluid, almost predatory grace. I sat frozen in my truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart was pounding, and my mind raced to make sense of what I'd just seen. When I finally managed to pull myself together, I drove the rest of the way home, constantly checking my mirrors as if I expected the creature to follow me. The rain continued to pour as I pulled into my driveway, and I sprinted into the house, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind against the windows, made me jump. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, maybe a bear or some other animal distorted by the rain and my own imagination. But deep down, I knew better. A few nights later, I was in my living room, reading by the soft glow of a lamp. The rain had returned, tapping lightly against the windows. The house was quiet, except for the occasional groan of the old wood floors. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps outside. At first, I thought it might be a stray dog, or maybe a deer wandering too close. But these steps were deliberate, methodical. They crunched through the wet leaves, circling the house. I turned off the lamp and moved to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. Peeking through the curtain, I scanned the yard, but the rain and darkness made it hard to see much. Then, just at the edge of the tree line, I saw them. 2 glowing red eyes, staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat. The eyes didn't blink or move. They just hovered there, burning like coals in the night. I stumbled back from the window, grabbing the rifle I kept by the door. When I looked again, the eyes were gone, but I wasn't reassured. I checked every window, but there was no sign of the creature. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That sense of unease lingered for the rest of the night, and even in the safety of my locked house, I couldn't relax. The next morning, I went outside to look for signs of what had been there. The rain had washed away any tracks, but I found broken branches near the tree line and a strange smell in the air, like wet fur and decay. It was faint, but distinct, and it made my stomach turn. Whatever had been out there wasn't gone. It was waiting. I decided to stay away from the woods for a while, but the creature didn't seem to care about boundaries. One night, I stepped outside to bring in some firewood. The air was cold and damp, and a thick fog had settled over the bayou. As I approached the woodpile, I felt that familiar sense of dread, like I was being watched. I turned toward the trees and froze. There it was again, standing just beyond the edge of the yard. The creature's red eyes burned through the fog, locked onto me with an intensity that made my knees weak. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was suffocating. I backed toward the house, keeping my eyes on it the entire time. When I reached the door, I bolted inside, slamming it shut and locking it. Grabbing my rifle, I stepped onto the porch, determined to confront whatever this thing was. But it was gone. The only evidence of its presence was the faint rustle of leaves as the fog swallowed the woods. I started asking around, trying to find anyone who might know what I'd seen. Most people dismissed it as a bear or some other animal, but one older neighbor, Mr. Thomas, listened intently. When I described the creature, his face grew serious. "Some folks around here call it the Rugaru," he said. "It's a legend, but legends don't come from nowhere. They say it's part man, part beast, cursed to roam the swamps and bayous. You'd best be careful, boy. That thing, it ain't something you want to mess with." Hearing someone else acknowledge the possibility of what I'd seen was both comforting and terrifying. It meant I wasn't imagining things, but it also meant the creature was real. I decided to set up a trail camera near the tree line, hoping to catch proof of its existence. For weeks, the camera captured nothing unusual. Then, one morning, I checked the footage and saw it. The creature was partially obscured by the trees, but its red eyes were unmistakable. It stood on two legs, its massive frame hunched forward as it stared directly into the camera. The footage was blurry, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I showed it to Mr. Thomas, who just shook his head. "You've got trouble on your hands," he said. "That thing doesn't look like it's passing through. It's watching you." After that, I stopped going outside after dark. I installed motion sensor lights around the house and double-checked the locks on all my doors and windows. The sightings became less frequent, but the sense of unease never went away. Even during the day, I'd catch myself glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see those burning red eyes staring back at me. It's been years since those encounters, but they've stayed with me. I still live in the same house, but I've learned to keep my distance from the woods. Whatever that creature was, it's still out there, and I have no desire to cross paths with it again. Some things are better left undisturbed, hidden in the shadows where they belong. The State Park Beast, from The Camping Guy, 24. This part is my friend's story, so I'm going to be telling it from his perspective. On a normal day after waking up, he got ready to take his weekly hike in the woods. Since it was Saturday, it was the perfect time to go again. So he packed up his gear and started driving. By the time he got to the state park, he was starving because he forgot to eat before he left, and he didn't want to eat all his food for the hike. Luckily for him, there was a general store near that served ice cream. So he scurried over to the store, got some ice cream, and went on his way. He started following the main trail for about an hour before he had to use the restroom. There weren't really that many people on the trail, so he figured he could head off the trail and go pee in the bushes. So that's what he did. He went off the trail, unzipped his pants, and he heard something. It was like a bear, but if a bear was standing on 2 feet walking. He heard this and got scared because he thought it was a bear. But he looked up as he was zipping up his pants, and there was what looked like a giant ape. He's talking arms the width of a normal-sized tree, and legs were almost the same size but maybe a little bigger. It was about 11 feet tall. It was just standing there about 60 yards away. He thought it was a statue of Bigfoot or something like that, but then it started moving, and he felt like he should get out of there. He found the path, followed it back to the visitor center, and drove back home, not knowing what to think of what he saw. This part is both me and my friend's story. My friend told me about what he saw, and I immediately believed him because he doesn't joke around about that kind of stuff. He asked me if I would come with him to go back to the state park to see if we can see the thing he saw, and he seemed pretty excited. So I said, why not? The next day, we drove to the visitor center and walked to the trails. He led me down the same path he was on that day, and we went to the exact spot he saw it. We saw nothing. We decided to camp out and come back in the morning. So we started pitching our tents and setting up camp after paying the fee. But my friend woke me up in the middle of the night, shaking me awake. As I woke up, I thought we were having an earthquake because the ground was shaking. But we peeked outside, and right above our tent, there was the creature shaking the tree we were under. It must have been shaking the roots because the ground was shaking. It must have hurt us, though, because it ran off, and we packed up and left that night because we were terrified. Guy trying to lure kids into the woods. From Anonymous. It was sometime in late September of 2017. I was invited over to my friend Aiden's house for the day, along with my friends Harry and Anthony. However, I was the only one who was available that day. At the time, me and Aiden, along with my other two friends, wanted to make a short horror film, which took place at an abandoned concrete building in the middle of the woods. Aiden says it's a farmhouse, while others say it was an insane asylum. I still don't know for sure what it is, but we decided to walk down there to set up some props there for when we film. The walk there was about 20 minutes. Right before you make it to the entrance, you must walk down an asphalt path through the middle of the woods, and then to your left would be the entrance to the abandoned place. So we made it to the building, which was about 4 stories tall and had 4 rooms. The first room was a large room with plenty of open space. The other rooms were smaller and were connected to each other, but separated from the first room. To get to the 4th room without walking around the building, you had to go through rooms 2 and 3 first. We made it to the building, and we decided to go to the last room to check for any props we could use. We searched around for a few minutes, but didn't find anything that was useful. We decided to head back to the first room and check there instead. However, when I turned my back and began walking, I heard a huge crunch of leaves coming from behind me. My heart stopped, and I quickly turned my head around and saw something swish behind a wall that I was just at. I immediately told Aiden, but he didn't believe me and told me to hurry up. I continued walking while looking behind me every few seconds. Doing so, I fell behind, and Aiden was almost back at the first room already. I ran to catch up with him, just when I got the doorway of the first room, and Aiden was only about 10 feet in front of me. An old man came out from behind a wall that was next to Aiden and stood in front of him. The old man shouted, "Oh, hello there!" and tried to grab Aiden. We immediately turned around and began running towards the back rooms, but doing so, Aiden tripped, though I continued running without even noticing. Aiden quickly got back on his feet and followed me. Instead of going to the back rooms, I took a sharp turn and cut through some plants and trees and ended up on another path that was next to the building that was intended for dirt bikes. Aiden caught up with me, and we began panicking, not sure what we should do. We could either run down the bike path over towards the entrance, but in the direction of the old man, or run the other way, but towards the other person that swished behind that wall, and not even knowing whether there was an exit that way. I tried to convince Aiden to go back towards the entrance, but he ran the other way, not wanting to be alone in this situation. I followed. The path cut through a tall grass field, which we ran through as fast as possible, with me looking behind myself frequently. The path ended right in front of another path we took to get to the building, so we cut through the tall grass and made it onto the path and began walking back to Aiden's house. We made it back to his neighborhood and sat down on a curb, drinking our bottles of water and discussing what happened, but eventually went back to his house after finishing our water. After that encounter, according to one of Aiden's friends, the next day they were riding their bike down the same asphalt path and past the entrance. Then they spotted the old man by the entrance, waving his hand to signal them to come in. As expected, they left as soon as possible. If that's the case, I'm pretty certain this was a PED trying to lure kids in. I seriously hope nobody fell for his trap. Laughing in the park, from a non-girl. A couple of summers ago, I was in a relationship with a shady dude. He used to get into trouble a lot, mostly because he would finesse people by selling them what was essentially a little bit of grass on top of tissue paper. In pill bottles they couldn't see through, and getting away with their money before they figured out. They got a lot less than what they paid for. But one night, he was planning on doing this to a really scary-looking dude, and I was already nervous that something was going to go down. But he left on his bike to meet the guy near the park, and told me he would be back in maybe 15 minutes at most. Well, a little less than an hour had passed. No texts from him at all, which wasn't a big surprise because he didn't have service, and his phone was already messed up to begin with. But I was terrified something bad happened. So I decided to go check the park out. I wore all black, and I brought a kitchen knife and flashlight with me. I was a huge baby when it came to the dark, but I needed to make sure my boyfriend was okay. I was thinking maybe the guy he was going to sell to had beaten the crap out of him, and he needed me to come help him. This happened once before, so I knew it may happen again. I started walking to the park. It's maybe a 5-minute walk, so I didn't need my car. I saw his bike laying out on the grass at the entrance of the park, and my heart immediately sank. Just to paint a picture, the park is very small, and woods surround the entire area, except for a small dirt trail. There are houses not too far from the center of the park, but the trees are pretty dense, so you could barely see the houses at night. On either end of the trail, there are neighborhood streets, and there are street lamps on both sides of the trail. But the trail was maybe half of a mile long, and because of the dense woods, it was pitch black in there at night. I turned on my flashlight and started walking onto the trail and very quietly calling my boyfriend's name, gradually getting a little louder. After about 5 minutes of that, I heard a sound coming from further down the trail. Maybe it was just me wanting to hear him and imagining him being hurt, but it sounded almost like groaning, like he was trying to tell me where he was, but he couldn't actually speak. I walked fast towards the sound and was trying to be reassuring and telling him it's okay and to keep making sounds so I could find him. I felt like I was getting closer, but then it sounded like the noise was drifting away from me and into the woods. I kept calling after him and telling him to wait and that I am here to help. I was too afraid to go deep into the woods, so I just stayed close to the trail and tried to look into the woods with my flashlight. The sound then seemed to move to the other side of the trail, and this time it was a little more clear and almost sounded like laughing. At this point, yeah, I'm scared, but I started getting annoyed because he used to prank me a lot, and I thought maybe he was just messing with me. I told him that this wasn't funny, and if he was messing with me, to just come out now. but I saw nothing. I just kept hearing the very short bursts of laughter every few seconds. I walked over to the other side and a little off the trail, but not into the actual wooded area. There was an entrance to a French drain, the big drains that are almost like a tunnel, in this ditch right near the trail, and I hear the sound come from inside of the drain. I felt a little better, in a way, because we had just seen the new It, and he knew I loved it and would reference or make jokes about it. He knew I was terrified of clowns, so he would never go so far as to dress up as Pennywise, but would joke about drains whenever we passed them or said he heard laughing. Part of me was just thinking that he was hiding in there on purpose to mess with me. I know it was stupid for me to think like that and not immediately run away from laughing coming from a drain, but I was still kind of worried about my boyfriend, and my mind was clouded, so I convinced myself that it was him making these noises. Even if he was beaten bloody, I was not going to jump into a ditch and go into a French drain in the middle of the night. I love horror movies, but I don't like being in one. I tried to look as far into the drain as I could from the ledge, still being aware of my surroundings in the woods, because I knew I was not going in there unless I saw him. I decided to give up because it had been maybe 20 to 30 minutes since I got there. So I called out that I was giving up and I'll be going home because at this point, it seemed like he was fine, just trying to scare me. I was walking towards one of the streets when my phone buzzed, and it was a Snapchat from my boyfriend. I rolled my eyes thinking he was sending me a picture of myself telling me, "I see you," or something dumb like that, because he always did that. But instead, it was a message from him apologizing for not getting a hold of me sooner, that his phone died and he was finally able to message me. He said his friend had to come help him, and he was at the friend's house, along with a picture of him and his friend. I was suddenly covered in cold sweat. I was mortified, and I started running home because I had just told whoever was in that park that I was leaving, and I was so scared that they were going to come after me. When I got home, I locked all of the doors and just laid in bed, frozen with fear. My boyfriend came home a while after I got home, and I told him what happened, and he turned pale. He slowly started to tell me that just a couple of nights before, his friend was walking through the same trail, and he heard laughing too. He had turned on his flashlight, jumped into the ditch with the drain, and standing a ways into the drain I was trying to peer into was a man poorly dressed like a clown, holding a knife and laughing in short bursts. His friend ran away, and the clown chased him for a little bit, and eventually gave up and walked back to the park. I started crying. I was so stupid to have been there, but thank God I didn't go down closer to the drain, because I know if I saw a clown, I wouldn't be able to move, let alone run away. Since that day, I have not gone to that park or even left my house alone at night. The Man Who Followed, from Nobody Amber 777. It was July 2020 when this happened. I was staying over at my brother's house for a few weeks of the summer. We'll call him John for privacy. To give you an idea of the area, his house is on a large steep hill in the middle of Kentucky. It is surrounded by vast woodland, and his driveway is about 10 minutes long to walk. Now that you have an idea of the area, I'll tell the story. We were playing on his Xbox when we finally got bored around 7 p.m. We debated on what to do when he came up with the idea of going outside for a walk around. I dubiously agreed, and we got ready for the long, dark walk. Keep in mind that it was getting dark at 6 p.m. Thinking back on this, I have no idea why I thought this was a good idea. It was stupid to begin with. Once we're ready, we head out. While walking down his driveway, there were definitely a few creepy noises, but nothing too bad. Once we get onto the road, that's when it all begins. I got a bad feeling as soon as we walked past his driveway. About 5 minutes of talking about life, we hear a branch break in the woods to the right of us. Stopping dead in our tracks, we look over to see what made the noise. We weren't able to see whatever made the noise and shook it off. We began to walk faster when the noise of someone walking through the woods became apparent. At this point, we were already 15 to 20 minutes through the walk and agreed to turn back. On our way back, it got closer. We knew we were being followed. We picked up the pace but kept up a normal conversation. "How is Mom doing?" he asked. "Oh, she's all right," I said. Normal stuff. About a minute from his driveway, we are stopped by the sound of a low chuckle. We start freaking out at the sound of this. We started running. The faster we got, the faster the thing in the woods got. I looked over with my flashlight to get a glimpse of whatever was following us. My blood ran cold. My flashlight illuminated a tall, bald man. He sees the flashlight and looks over, stopping. He smiled with his ugly yellow teeth. I ran faster than I ever had. I made a 10-minute run in 5. When we got to John's house, we shut and locked every window and door in his house. We looked out the window about 5 minutes after entering and saw him in the nearby forest. His flashlight pointed up towards his face. My brother got his gun and shot out. He ran off into the darkness. His flashlight must have been bright enough to shine for at least a mile, because we watched it for a few minutes. That was the first encounter with the man, and hopefully the last. Playing games with ghosts. From Big Bad. I live in a quiet historical town on the Kansas-Missouri state line. It's far from the back roads, but smaller than most. The woods nearby are beautiful, especially in autumn. Looking back at what happened, it may make sense. We were in the very heart of the Bleeding Kansas conflict, pre-Civil War. John Brown, love him or hate him, scalped a lot of farmers. Tons of other grisly murder stories are tied to the area. The local college even has a ghost tour that runs through downtown. But that's what I'm about to tell you. What I've seen may be related to some obscure haunting, but beyond that, I have little clue what this man was doing. It was last week. My home is on the edge of the suburbs, so I'm seated right by a lovely creek and some woods. There's a paved trail alongside it, and I frequently take walks after dinner, or I used to. I'm usually alone, which is all the better. The white noise of the creek water gurgling and the very last of the day's bird calls always brightened my mood. I began my route later than usual, around 7:30 p.m. The sun had already been swallowed by the horizon of cottonwood trees, and the sky was dark violet. By then, the lampposts had activated, outlining the trail in their sticky orange light. I was shivering a little. I only had a t-shirt and flannel. It had been 75 Fahrenheit just yesterday. Now it was 20 below that. Guess that's just the Midwest experience. I got about 3 miles in, usually where I'd turn back home, when a noise caught my attention. I peered ahead of me to see another man walking down the path in my direction. He was counting out loud. 44, 45, 46, 47. I stood there, confused. As he stepped under one of the lights, I saw that he had a bandana tied across his face like a blindfold. He was dressed in a black hoodie and soft blue pants, and seemed to be the age of one of the college students from just out of town. I was too curious to just mind my own business and go home, so I waited right out of reach of one of the lamppost lights. More details were revealed as he stepped closer and counted ever higher. He was holding a sheet of paper in his left hand, like it was ripped from a notebook. He was smiling too, as he counted. By now he had reached 85. Was he on some sort of drug? I know there are some nasty hallucinogenics and deliriants, like DPH, that are unfortunately not unheard of spreading around here, mainly by the college. I'm not a small guy and he didn't seem to notice me. So I decided to lurk there, shivering, before asking if he was all right. I stepped into the light, and he must have perceived me through his bandana. He stopped counting and grinned. He lifted his blindfold and then suddenly looked very disappointed. "Hey, kid, are you all right?" I asked. He then glared at me before yelling, "Damn it, you've ruined it! Why?" "Sorry, man. Ruined what?" I asked, before he then began panicking. He tossed his bandana away and looked behind him, uttering "no" repeatedly under his breath. "What were you even trying to do? Can I fix it?" I'm playing games with ghosts here, and you made me break the rules. And He then stared right at me, his eyes wide and grimacing in horror. Then, as his gaze seemed to focus on something behind me, he dropped to the ground like a sack of bricks. Shocked, I kneeled down to help him. I reached out my hand and almost felt him before I hesitated, looking behind me. I saw nothing but the black of the night and the buzz of the lampposts and rhythm of the creek. Every hair on my body raised, and it felt downright freezing. I decided to run away, back home. I looked back at the young man on the ground. He still was not moving. I sprinted hysterically the whole way back to my house. Inside, I sat in front of the door the whole night before falling asleep. The next morning, I awoke on the hard tile of my foyer. After getting up in a daze, I remembered last night, and I remembered how I left that man to possibly die out on the trail. Did he die? I couldn't bring myself to venture onto the trail to see if he was still there until it was almost noon. Once I reached the 3-mile mark, however, he was gone. A few other people, including a Dam family on a picnic, were on the trail and enjoying their day, unaware of last night completely. He had said he was playing games with ghosts. I had broken some rule, apparently, and that caused something. I looked online to see some paranormal games. These guides tell you how to summon some occult entity and provide an exhaustive list of rules you must follow and a condition to win the game with this spirit. One that freaked me out was one-man hide and seek, where you, and any other hiders if you aren't alone, fill a doll with your nail clippings and rice before stabbing it with scissors and saying, "Found you." Then you leave the scissors with the doll and go hide, and at dawn you must dump salt on the doll to end the game. I theorized that whoever that was might have been playing one of these ghost games, or thought they might have been, and had some panic attack when I encountered them and broke the rules. There had been no local news on anyone going missing or anything, and I don't know if that should comfort me or not. Either way, my favorite route to walk has been ruined. My skate park horror. From Anonymous. I have been a fan of skating ever since I was little. There is this skate park near my home that I often skate at. After my recent experience, I think I should just skate at home. The other day, I was at home watching TV when I decided to go skating. The sun was almost about to set when I left my house, but that didn't stop me. When I reached the skate park, I noticed it was empty, probably because it was a Wednesday. For me, it was a relief since I like skating alone. I put my roller skates on and started skating. After 15 or so minutes of skating, I noticed a black SUV pull up by the park. My eyes were locked on that SUV as I was skating. I couldn't see inside the vehicle because the sun had set, so the dark surrounded the vehicle. I had kept my eyes on the vehicle for quite some time, but I noticed no one had exited it. I shrugged it off, thinking that maybe the person was waiting for someone. A few moments later, when I had forgotten about the SUV, my eyes suddenly caught a glimpse of something. I saw 2 people exiting the SUV. They seemed to be coming my way. They looked tough, and they certainly weren't short, about 6 feet tall. I still couldn't see their faces, though, as the night surrounded them. I noticed one of them pull out a knife from their pockets. I decided to run, but my skates hindered me from doing so. In a quick action, I bent down and unfurled my skates. When I noticed the two men were now sprinting at me, I could now see their faces, and boy, were they a terrible sight. They looked so disfigured. Just as my skates came off, I made a run for it into the woods behind me. I ran the fastest I ever did. I swear I was tearing up from the adrenaline rush. The footsteps behind me grew quieter and quieter to the point they were gone. I hid behind a tree and spied from it. They were gone, or so I thought. A few minutes behind the tree, and I started to get impatient, so I sneaked to my car. I went around the skate park and to the parking lot. There I noticed the same black SUV parked in the same spot. They were still there. I crouched and continued to walk towards my car. I hoped to God that my car's unlock beep didn't alert the two, wherever they were. As I stood up to reach my door on the other side of the car, through the window, I saw them. They were glaring at me. I didn't even think of it, and got into my car, locked my doors, and started it up. The two freaks started banging on my window. I was on the verge of fainting from the horror. I started my car and backed up, realizing that I might have driven over one of their feet as I felt a slight bump and drove away. I safely reached home and saw that the bump I felt was actually a slit tire. Yes, the freak slit my tire as I was escaping. This has been my scariest encounter ever. I think it's better to just skate at home from now on. The mysterious sounds in the forest. From June Bird. I love camping. I've loved it for as long as I can remember, and throughout all of my camping experiences, I haven't experienced anything like this before. This happened early last year, and I was with my friend who we'll call Amy. We were camping together in a popular campground, and it was me, my mom, and my friend. Everything was normal until we were getting into our tent to go to sleep at a pretty late hour. I don't remember exactly, though. We were in the tent and had been talking for several hours, when all of a sudden, we heard a really loud, odd sound coming from an unknown source. The best way to describe the sound was a Zen bell blasted extremely loud and kind of a deep sound. It was a bit like a natural disaster alarm in the way that it would repeat itself in increments. When it happened the first time, me and my friend both looked at each other in confusion because neither of us knew what it was. We were kind of weirded out, but decided to continue the conversation. The sound went on for several hours after the first time, and probably continued after we were asleep. It was odd, because we didn't know why it would be playing, who was playing it, how it was played, or anything about it. It was just kind of weird to hear such a loud and man-made sound in the woods at such a late hour. Anyway, we still have no idea what it was to this day. What was that? From the Bat Bob. I am a guard on a base in Australia. Think huge woodland-type area with buildings here and there. I was on patrol one night at about 11 p.m. near a fork in the road I would travel. I was pulled to the side, having a snack, when I felt something watching me from ahead. Now I am used to animals being all around me here, kangaroos, foxes, etc. But this thing was staring, not running away, as I was used to seeing. Now I flicked on my car's floodlights. This thing was still staring at me, and it looked like a bigger-than-normal fox. We sat staring across from each other for a few minutes when I figured I am going to see what the hell this is. It started to walk across the road, and it moved like it had seen how a fox would move, but wasn't sure how to do it. Its body was longer than a normal fox and grayer. I was moving closer in the car, the floodlights still catching its eyes that were on me the whole time, until it had crossed the road, and I pulled level to the driver's side. The whole time, this thing stared at me. Then, without warning, it stood up on its feet, and I heard a high-pitched laughter that felt like it was at me. I got out of there and tried not to think about it. But on my way back, I thought I need to know what is going on. I know. Mistake. I pulled over to the side of the road, pulled out my trusty flashlight, and turned it on. I walked towards the area, sweeping the ground in front of it. It was flat. No holes or anything that a creature could pop down and away. Just then, my light flickered, and off it went. I heard the same laugh. I ran and left that area like a bat out of hell, and for the next month when I worked there, I always felt like I was being watched. I was moved to a different role on the base, standing guard at a gatehouse. I still felt watched. When one morning I walked towards the gatehouse, I heard the laugh and saw a tail disappear under the gatehouse. To this day, I have no idea what I saw. A rabbit or something else? From Lilia Radk. I'm not sure if this is just me being paranoid from listening to your podcast or what I saw. This happened in my hometown, Kotka, in Finland. I had been at my friend's place after school until 11 p.m., and now I was walking home in the dark. In my neighborhood, there are many patches of forest all around the place. I think there's less housing than there is forest. I was about 1 kilometer away from home. There was forest on both sides of the road. There's a bigger road behind one of the forest patches. I could already see the local store, but the eerie feeling of being surrounded by dark forest still hung around. I had kept my eyes on the ground to not look at the forest. I looked up as I was coming to a crosswalk. There's a truck stop on the opposite side of the road. At the truck stop, there it was sitting, a rabbit-like creature. I wasn't bothered by it, as there's a lot of wildlife in the area. I kept walking as the creature kept sitting there. Now that I was closer, about 15 meters away, I could see that it was way too big to be a rabbit. It was about the same size as a public trash can. It was white with light brown spots. My old dog died when I was 6. That thing was the same size and color as the dog. It stood up when I stopped. It started walking along the road, getting closer and closer to the forest. I kept walking, not taking my eyes off of it. The dog kept making sure that I was walking. It felt so familiar. It felt like he wanted me to follow. I had to fight the urge to follow it. As it got to the edge of the forest, we both stopped. We stared at each other from opposite sides of the road. As it realized that I wasn't following, it took one last step and disappeared into thin air. I'm a fast walker, but the walk home took forever. I was terrified. I only felt safe when I closed the door behind me. The familiar feeling never went away. I've seen the same dog before, but this was the first time he's asked me to follow him. I've seen other pets or family members that have passed away. They never need me for anything.
Thanks for stopping by our little campsite here at Outdoor Terrors. To hear your story on the show, send it to us at darkstories.org. For more scary stories from me, catch me on my other podcasts, Unexplained Encounters and Tales from the Break Room, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Or go to eeriecast.com for those and even more terrifying podcasts. Follow me on X or Twitter at Prevails, and if you don't mind, leave a rating for Outdoor Terrors on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Till next time, I'll see you soon when the campfire blazes once again.